Welcome to Concepts in American Government at Mesa Community College. This video explores civil rights and civil liberties and freedom in America. To understand what civil liberties and civil rights are, it's useful to think of them in terms of freedom from and freedom to rights. By freedom to rights, I mean you have the freedom to, and then fill in the blank. You have the freedom to assembly. You have the freedom to worship. You have the freedom to speech. These freedoms are considered our civil liberties. They're your ability to engage in actions, that your actions are not curtailed by the government. Those are your liberties. Civil rights, on the other hand, can be thought of as freedom from rights. You are free from unlawful search and seizure. You are free from cruel and unusual punishment. The freedom from rights, your civil rights, are limits on government action. The state is curtailed in its action relative to you. So your civil rights represent limitations on the state, where your civil liberties represent a lack of limitations on yourself and on your person. When we're talking about rights, particularly when rights can be at odds with one another and we have to make choices about whose rights are going to be guaranteed and whose are not, it's important to ground that discussion of rights in pluralism. Now, if you remember the discussion about the founders at the beginning of this course, the founders argued that we should have a pluralist society. Pluralism is that notion that factions within a society compete with each other for power and influence. They compete with each other that their preferred policy outcome will succeed at the expense, perhaps, of another group's preferred policy outcome. Pluralism argues that these groups can constantly compete for power, but no one of those groups wins every single battle. That the group that wins alternates. Not necessarily, they don't take turns, but one group will win one battle, maybe it wins 2 or 3 in a row, but then another group might win a battle. The game is not rigged so that one group wins all the time. Now, in a pluralist society, the function of government is to act as a referee between those groups. And the argument was that as these groups compete for power, they will prevent any one group from dominating, which would prevent the rise of tyranny in this American experiment in democracy. The problem, though, is that in the real world, in American history, that ideal situation that pluralism describes of groups competing for power, none of whom are privileged over another, has never really existed. That it has always been the case in our country that some groups have more access to power than other groups. Some groups have more access to economic gain than other groups. The contest between these groups, then, is not really a fair contest. The game, indeed, is rigged in some ways to prefer or privilege some groups over other groups. The civil rights struggle that occurred throughout our country's history but culminated in the 1960s illustrates this notion that the contest was not fair, that the system had been rigged to prevent a group of citizens from exercising the rights and privileges accorded to them by the Constitution. Now, this structural inequality persists in many ways through America, and this creates problems for our democratic theory. One reason this matters, the fact that some groups are privileged over others, is because a democracy depends on a stable, engaged citizenry. And for that to happen, there needs to be some measure of equality, or at least the perception that equality might happen in the future. If we look at the diagram on the slide, what we have is a visual representation of two different societies. On the one society on the left, we have the population where there are a few rich or elite members of that society, then a small middle class, and then the majority of that society is poor. Now, that pyramid represents the class or power distribution in many parts of the world. These societies that are characterized by a triangle in a power structure are typically authoritarian societies, or if they're democracies, their democracies are short-lived. One reason is because if your society looks like the triangle and you hold an election, the majority wins an election. Well, a majority of this society is poor, and so those people are likely to support candidates who are revolutionary or radical in their views of economy. They're going to change the economic system because the system is rigged to support the elite. And so maybe they're going to nationalize an industry, or carve up a plantation and give it to peasants. Any number of reforms that might redistribute wealth and help the poor population out. Well, the problem is that the rich and elite in those societies aren't typically willing to let that just happen. The society benefits them the way it's currently structured, and they control the economic, political, academic, and military power structures of that society. And so typically, when elections happen in societies like this, one of two things happen after a populist politician has been elected. They either put their arm around the populist and say, "Congratulations on your new election. Welcome to the club. You now are going to be part of the elite." And they co-opt the leadership into the elite class. Or if the populist candidate resists that, what happens more often than not is the candidate is awoken at 2 a.m. by the guys with guns, and the democracy ends. And this pattern happens over and over again throughout Latin America, Africa, Southern Asia. Democracies tend to be highly unstable in these types of societies. Now, contrast that with a society that looks like the one on the right, a diamond shape, where you have a few rich and elite members of society, and you have a few poor and disadvantaged members of society, but the majority of the population lives somewhere in that middle class, maybe at the top, maybe at the bottom, but they're in the middle class. In this society, a populist, radical candidate typically does not win the election, because that middle class are not revolutionaries. They have jobs. They're making enough money to pay their mortgage. They have a reasonable hope that their kids will be able to go to college. They don't have a reason to support a radical plan to shift the distribution of power in society. So the candidates that they support tend not to threaten the position of the rich or elite and trigger a counter-democratic revolution. So, in a society where the majority of the citizens have a stake in maintaining stability, the society itself becomes very stable. Okay, so what does all this mean for civil rights? Well, when we apply that concept of the triangle versus the diamond to the electoral body of a democracy, and one that is marked by structured inequality, it creates some potential problems. Now, in America, the structured inequality of our country tends to fall along three lines: race, money, and education. You can predict a person's economic well-being and station in life to a great degree of accuracy if you know their race, the financial background of their parents, and the level of education they've achieved. Those three factors are huge indicators for future success. In the United States, class is not a solid boundary. People move up and down through class boundaries. Poor people get rich, rich people get poor. But where those boundaries become solid is when race is involved, or if education levels change from one generation to the next. And then, again, the amount of money your parents have has a great determining factor over the amount of money that you'll have. So we seem to have some structured inequality here in America. Why does all this matter? It matters because the more unequal a society can be, the closer it becomes to that triangle as opposed to the diamond shape, the less stable the democracy is. See, the underclass, whether that's defined through race, money, or educational means, the less privileged in society, have to have hope. They have to have a stake in the system. They have to believe that the system is not rigged in a way to guarantee their failure. If they believe that it's possible to succeed, then they will accept the legitimacy of that system, even if they do not succeed. They just have to feel that it is possible to succeed, to get that legitimacy. Now, if there's a permanent class system built along racial or educational lines, that creates resentment, because the disadvantaged members of society look at the system and say, the system is rigged. It is impossible for me or my children to advance in the system. And at that point, they lose their stake in the system. They don't accept the legitimacy of the system any longer. And that then breeds disorder and rebellion. And that pattern repeats itself again and again through struggling democracies around the world. This means that all groups in society, whatever their station in life, have a stake in ensuring a fair contest. If you belong to a privileged group, it's still in your interest to advance the cause of unprivileged groups. And clearly, if you belong to an unprivileged group, it's in your interest to advance the cause of fair contests and underprivileged groups. So this is one reason why this question of civil rights and civil liberties matters to everyone in the country, whatever group or whatever position of privilege they may hold. This video is brought to you by Dr. Brian Dilley. I'm a political science professor at Mesa Community College, one of the 10 schools of the Maricopa District.